Well, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to all of you, and thank you so much for having joined us on this discussion on African infrastructure. My name is Frederick Berenger, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. I'd like to start with a quick thanks to the organizers for having put this discussion together, and particularly to Jihan, who's sitting at the back of this room, who's done a tremendous job in putting this panel together. So thank you very much. Improving the continent's infrastructure is really the foundation on which Africa's development rests. And I'm always struck by the fact that discussions on Africa and on African infrastructure are somewhat tainted by pessimism. I mean, indeed, the needs are tremendous, and there's still a long way to go. But I hope that today we'll be able to show that, that infrastructure are also an extraordinary opportunity for the African continent. Now, of the $93 billion per year that the World Bank estimates that are needed to close Africa's infrastructure gap, just under half is currently financed. And that leaves us with a gap of about $45 or $48 billion to be financed. Now, this is certainly a useful figure to bear in mind. But thinking the future of Africa's infrastructure is by no means only a matter of money. And there's plenty of capital in the world today looking for attractive returns. So if we are to make any progress, I believe we should try to see beyond just money at what could really effectively be driving infrastructure development today. Now, with this in mind, there are two key issues that I would like us to tackle today. The first one is about reaching bankability. Now, it seems to me that the most daunting challenge will be to de-risk infrastructure investment if the private sector is to engage. Just as important, the second aspect will be to redefine the role between the public and the private sector. You know, traditionally, the public sector has carried much of the weight when it comes to infrastructure development, while the risk-averse or the more risk-averse private actors have failed to engage. And this model today has clearly shown its limits, and the public sector is looking for new ways to leverage its limited financial means. So bringing more projects to bankable levels and rethinking the role sharing between the public and the private sectors, these are the two main issues that we will aim to provide answers to you today in a discussion that will last somewhat over an hour, through which, of course, we'll be very happy to take questions from the audience. Now, to discuss these crucial issues, I am very delighted to be welcoming 6 fantastic speakers with me on this session, who each bring their own topical experience with infrastructure finance, and I would like to briefly introduce them to you. Immediately to my left, Louis Bedusha is a senior business development officer with MIGA, the World Bank's agency in charge of promoting foreign direct investments into developing countries. Louis brings extensive experience from the private sector, and in his previous capacity, Louis worked for Lazare, for whom he was in charge of emerging economies. To his left, Thomas Meyer is the managing director in charge of infrastructure at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And with the EBRD, Thomas has helped Eastern and Central European and Central Asian countries foster economic transformation through private sector involvement, and as such, Thomas's experience will be extremely valuable to this discussion today. To his left, Jordi Baccaria is the current director of SIDOP, an independent, non-partisan think tank based in Barcelona that contributes to ongoing international debates. He's been a long-time professor of economics and has written extensively on economic integration, on Latin America, and on the Mediterranean economy. To his left, Bruno Venn is the chairman of the management board of KfW DEG, which is the financial arm of Germany's development cooperation and one of the largest European development finance institutions. Bruno has dedicated his career to development policy with KfW, working successively for the South Asia Department and heading the bank's division for financial cooperation with Sub-Saharan Africa. To his left, Tran Tihimai is the current Director General of Alstom Transports for Morocco. Alstom is a global leader in the world of power generation, of power transmission, of rail infrastructure, and has been very dynamic in Africa recently. And as such, Transinput will be crucial to understanding infrastructure challenges from a private sector's perspective. Last but not least, Hatem Shabani is Principal Infrastructure Officer at the African Development Bank. He also brings extensive experience from the private sector, having previously worked with Vinci, with Atkins Management Consultants, and with McDonald's. Hatem, as I introduced you last, I'll start with you. Can we please, in a nutshell, can you please tell us where we stand today when it comes to infrastructures in Africa? How did we get there, and what are the main bottlenecks that we're looking at?
Well, the situation of infrastructure in Africa, as you rightly mentioned at the beginning, I mean, there's a major backlog of infrastructure in Africa today, and there is also a major shortage, at least from the public side, of financing. So this is the sort of the scene today, and there'll be needs to really further develop the infrastructure to enable the first stimulus for the economic growth in those areas to happen, so that economic growth will generate revenues that actually can further develop infrastructure. So we're really still at the beginning of the curve, really, the development curve. And that context is really very different from other regions in the world, unfortunately. Man. Africa is lagging behind a lot, and that's probably the reason why most of the development institutions like ours are overly focusing on infrastructure. I mean, we as African Development Bank, we do invest almost 2/3 of our portfolio in infrastructure. So that's the situation.
What would you say are the main bottlenecks today when it comes to infrastructure investment?
In terms of bottlenecks, from my own experience in the African context, really I can really sort of structure them into incapacity, lack of capacity in preparing good projects. That's mostly on the public side, because they are the entities that actually identify and do the planning. Lot of capacity in actually undertaking serious detailed studies that can look at all the projects from all the angles, the economic, technical, for some cases would involve the private sector, the legal and the financial aspects. They often lack that capacity. There are plenty of actually funds around, multilateral funds that can help preparation of the project, but it's the inability of those governments officials really to even formulate the project and formulate the request for the project, you know, that is still not there in many cases. And we do as institutions try as much as we can to help them through technical assistance and capacity building to help them at least identify good projects, define those projects, and build consensus around those projects before you get to a stage where, you know, you begin talking about really sources of financing. So that stage is still, unfortunately, not there. In many cases. In the other important element is really what I call the business environment in those countries. It's the business. I mean, there are plenty of money out there waiting to be invested, but you don't see good projects. And also, if there is a good project, the country context is not good, and investors find themselves confronted with a lot of risks that sometimes they cannot bear, or if they try to bear, they will actually raise the cost of financing to the point where the project becomes non-viable. Things like the economic risk, the risk of the countries not having clear fiscal economic policies that lead them to often great economic risk. They will lead them to great exchange rate risk. They will lead them to great political and instability risks, and so on. So all those risks actually deter the investors from coming forward to actually invest in such projects. So these are really the two main areas that government will have to work on. I mean, things like government will have really to comfort the investors, or the lenders like we are, in the rule of law in the country. So it's actually when you tender, the way you select, the way you actually evaluate the bids, that's an important element. The transparency in that. Also, the way you honor your contractual engagement. These are also an important element, and the like. So these are all important elements that the governments have. The governance, strong governance. So this is the second element. The third element is beyond really the studies themselves and the preparation of the project, is to have the ability to comfort the investors, particularly for privately financed projects. Things like roadshows. If you do roadshows, for example, and when you get the political leaders coming to those roadshows to show the political commitment to those projects, that comforts really the business people. That also comfort us as donors, that there is a commitment to the project. All these aspects, I think the government will have to learn to do them, because they're competing for finance. Although the finance is there, but they have to show that strong will for things to move forward. Yeah.
Bruno, when we speak about African infrastructure, there's always this idea of infrastructure gap that comes up, and which would seem to suggest that African infrastructure could be summed up in terms of lacking capital. Do we really have a money problem when it comes to infrastructure? I mean, there's a lot of capital available in the world. And if you take African pension funds alone, I mean, they have about $450 billion of assets. How do you see this?
Yeah, you are completely right. I do not believe that we have a finance issue. Because there's a lot of capital around, and especially what you mentioned with pension funds. So for example, Nigeria embarked now on a very ambitious program to privatize the power sector, and they have started with a lot of tenders. And at the same time, they are arguing that they need a lot of capital. But they have in pension funds more than 25 billion of US dollars are blocked there. So by simple changing, let me say, the regulation in which pension funds are working, we can mobilize a lot of additional capital for Africa. And I think if what Atem has mentioned, if the conditions are right, then the private sector is coming in and can mobilize a huge amount of funding. And let me also say, yes, we have in Africa a huge infrastructure gap, but we have also, we should not ignore that this is also based on, let me say, a success story in Africa. We have now seen for more than 10 years a huge increase in economic growth. And this economic growth is now putting a lot of pressure on a rather weak and fragile infrastructure. And that in itself is now a major bottleneck for development, because the private sector needs infrastructure. Look to Lagos. When you drive through Lagos, you always see captive power. Everybody is using captive power. That's a nightmare in terms of economic cost, the financial cost, but also from an environmental point of view, it's not sustainable. So getting things right, then we can also promote it in the private sector, because I'm representing a DFI and I'm also representing the European Development Finance Institute, and we have more than 4 billion invested in the Africa infrastructure. Why? Because we we strongly believe that infrastructure is a key for private sector development in Africa. Because if we would like to see that more and more African businesses are having a real chance to be competitive in a globalized world, then we have to invest heavily in infrastructure in Africa. I really don't understand why it costs 10 times to send a container from Mombasa to Kampala than to send the container from any kind of port of Europe, China, or US to Mombasa. So how we can expect that the private sector in the 18 landlocked countries we have in Africa, which are heavily dependent on the infrastructure in the neighboring countries, connecting them to the major ports, that they can compete with a globalized world. This is why we strongly believe that the infrastructure is a key, and we are also very optimistic that more and more governments recognize to do what they need to do, and then I think the private sector, the Development Finance Institute, and also development banks are ready to provide the funding.
Now, we've mentioned stable policy and long-term political backing as preconditions for infrastructure investment. Thomas, in the transitioning Eastern European countries, you faced quite a few daunting challenges yourself when it comes to political support and regulatory stability. What lessons did you draw from your experience in those countries, and what could we take with us in an African context?
Thank you. First of all, of course, our universe of countries is also quite diverse, but I think there are a number of interesting experiences that we could make in Eastern Europe. The first one is, Frederick, as you quite rightly said in your opening statement, capital as such, the lack of capital is not the key issue. When there is a good project, financiers will come, and we ourselves have seen this in the height of the financial crisis 2009, 2010. The biggest European infrastructure projects, in fact, came from Russia and Turkey, and we could all finance them despite the risk perception that existed. Secondly, I can only second those speakers who said that project preparation or lack of project preparation is a key bottleneck for projects to come to the market, and that has been very much our experience. When we and others involved ourselves in project preparation, we could make sure that some of these interesting projects actually found investors. Thirdly, and perhaps this is sort of a specific Eastern European experience and perhaps interesting in the longer term for Africa, is the fact that in addition to private investors, you also need to increase and facilitate subnational investments. City governments need to be empowered both structurally and financially and legally to do more investments at subnational level directly based on the needs that these municipalities, regions need. And when you put these three elements together, better project preparation, facilitation of good regulatory framework, and consistency of policy at national level, plus an empowered subnational sector, then you can see, and we have seen in many of our countries, an infrastructure uplift, and this infrastructure uplift is absolutely crucial to drive diversification and economic growth.
I mean, there's this interesting idea that comes out of empowering local governments. Jeudi, I think Spain has quite an experience with that as well in the infrastructure sector. Could you tell us a little bit more about the Spanish experience?
Yes, thank you. The case of Spain is a particular case because, you know, the crisis has changed a lot what we expect about some of infrastructural projects. I think there are some risks, and you need to take into account these risks. The case of Spain, I think it's very interesting to explain in theory. I mean, I'm afraid that I am surrounded by practitioners. I am professor. I mean, these two risks are, one is the big projects of infrastructure could be sometimes as a white elephant. I mean, how to prevent these white elephants in the investments, because when the economics grow, there is not a problem, but when there are some crises like now, then it's difficult to support this high burden, especially financed by taxes and taxes paid by the middle class, and in particular the middle class, of course, is the engine for this growth. I mean, it's like a vicious circle. The other risk is the risk of the rent seekers. Big projects attract big money, big finances, and then it's very difficult from the local governments and regional governments and even of the state government to prevent this apparition of the rent seekers looking for rents and not to create benefits or gains producing goods and services. And I think that the experience of Spain, it's, you can explain some lessons that the countries of the South and African countries should take in account to prevent rent seekers, to prevent white elephants in the big infrastructures.
Turning to you, what does the private sector expect from governments and from international financial institutions to engage in infrastructures in Africa? And I ask this bearing in mind that the IT and the communications sector capture some 80% of private investment flows on the African continent. So we need to find new ways to foster more investment toward energy, toward water, toward transport, for which you work directly. Which are the most risky sectors and where the most dire needs are to be found?
Well, I am a lucky person because all my colleagues have already delivered some of the problems at stake before starting and having a successful project. So, in fact, yes, if we can match challenges, the challenge is really this one, to have the matching between good preparation, good context, good maths, the good economics, the good business model, and the empowerment of the local governments or cities and smaller public entities. So to me, yes, in my experience, I can say that there were occasions where the 3 or the 4 or the 5 inputs were together and were successfully together. And Alstom today in Morocco installed in 5 or 6 years 2 tramways already. So this is an infrastructure in transportation. Transportation mean for a public quality, a more public quality service for the cities. And we installed that not only with French subsidies through RPEs or French funding, but also through Moroccan fundings. And those two, the combination of those two, leads today the country to have 2 spectacular showcases, which can be examples for other new cities here in Tanger, for example. Because I know that there are some projects in preparation, so there are some studies. The representative of SciCub told us that yes, we need some engineering and good, proper engineering done. So this engineering is on the way. We have to accompany them as an industrial. Of course, we cannot substitute ourselves to the engineering companies, but we need the help of the bankers and of not normal bankers. I learned today that you have to say development bankers. So you need those development bankers to set the framework and set the frame of a successful and viable business model. But I think that the industrials today not only Alstom, but also the other ones who are installing energy power plants, but also transportation system, can find a lot of elements and a lot of examples in the world and in the Middle East, which can testify that it's possible.
So we need the bankers, you say, and I have
definitely yes.
Definitely yes, and I have one to my very left. Louis, if the funds are there, it seems to me that one of the most, or one of the challenges that Tran is mentioning is really to de-risk infrastructure investment if the private sector is to engage. You know, some people describe Africa as the continent of economic misperception, where risks are grossly overestimated and investment opportunities underestimated. Your job is to manage investment risks. How can we deal with investment risks in infrastructure in the African context?
Can I just add something, Frederick, or
course,
was it a question for another of my colleagues? Yes, on the risk issue, there are some tools to master the risk. Certainly, yes. So if you take, for instance, the model of a PPP, if you just build from the beginning, upstream, you design your project, you design totally your project, not only technically, but also economically. You do the maths, as we say. You de-risk because you can master the economics of the project, you can master the execution of the project, you can master all the interfaces between all the lots, and you are sure when you go for it that you will master the total execution and then the maintenance and the operation of the project. If you do a lot-by-lot approach, of course, the risk is superior, and in the tender phase in which we often work, we, of course, have to raise our rates of risk, which sometimes leads to some heavy prices, let's say it. And those heavy prices are linked, indeed, to the absence of mastering really the whole process of an infrastructure or a transportation system, because it's not only one single lot who makes the system or the servers. It's a whole big thing that you have to put in place, and not only for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, but you put it in place for 50 or 100 years.
Just before giving it back to you, Thomas, I just wanted to have Louis' take on this.
Excusez-moi, je vais passer au français. C'est possible, on peut parler français?
Bien sûr.
Merci. Oui, alors nous, on n'a pas une vue, je dirais, aussi négative. Hein. Pour nous, le Middle East et l'Afrique, ce sont des continents un peu explosifs en termes de projets d'infrastructure et de projets énergie, de projets transport. Le problème, c'est qu'on est plus gêné par l'abondance des projets que par leur rareté. Donc on a plus ce problème-là à gérer. Alors, si vous voulez, mon agence, historiquement, couvrait le risque politique. Le risque politique, c'était le risque standard, c'était Tintin, quoi. Vous voyez, c'était la guerre, c'était... bon, ce risque politique-là que l'on couvre ne suffit pas aujourd'hui à rendre les projets d'infrastructure au sens large du terme, hein, c'est-à-dire énergie, oil and gas, transport, télécom, ne suffit pas à rendre ces projets finançables. Pourquoi? Parce que, en général, dans ces projets énergie, oil and gas, on est en face des États. Et que dans ces structures de project finance, l'État ou une entreprise publique ou une SPC couverte par l'État est amené à donner des garanties, et ces garanties ne sont pas suffisantes. Les banquiers en particulier, puisque vous disiez, monsieur, et madame aussi, qu'on avait besoin des banquiers, les sponsors en equity et les banquiers ne sont pas en général rassurés par les signatures publiques qu'ils ont en face d'eux, et ne sont pas en général suffisamment rassurés par la signature des entreprises publiques qu'ils ont en face d'eux. Donc, mon agence a changé de politique assez récemment en lançant deux produits relativement innovants et est finalement assez, un peu, j'ose le dire, un peu révolutionnaire. Le premier, c'est d'apporter le triple A implicite de la Banque mondiale à des États. Alors, ça veut dire quoi? Ça veut dire que si une banque fait un prêt, j'ai un peu de concurrence, hein, mais c'est pas grave, je vais essayer de finir. Si une banque fait un prêt à un État souverain, eh bien, dans certains cas, nous pouvons apporter notre garantie à cet État et faire en sorte que ce prêt soit considéré comme un prêt triple A. Alors, cette garantie peut être apportée à un État, et pour répondre à mes deux voisins de gauche et trois voisins de gauche, on peut aussi apporter cette garantie à un sous-souverain, c'est-à-dire par exemple à une municipalité. Pour prendre un exemple que connaissent mes amis d'Alstom, même si je ne suis pas sûr qu'ils aient gagné tous les appels d'offres, je pense au métro d'Istanbul. La municipalité d'Istanbul a contracté un emprunt auprès d'un certain nombre de banques. Ces banques étaient contre-garanties par le ministère des Finances turc, et nous avons apporté notre garantie au ministère des Finances turc. Ce qui fait en réalité que les banques faisaient un prêt entre guillemets, implicitement, à une institution AAA. Donc ça, c'est extrêmement important parce que ça permet de lever un premier verrou. Un premier verrou, c'est que les États ne sont pas, entre guillemets, les États africains et d'autres. Hein, je veux dire, il n'y a pas que les États africains, il y a les États asiatiques, les États européens, ne présentent pas des garanties suffisantes pour des projets importants. La deuxième chose qu'on a faite beaucoup plus récemment, il y a quelques mois, c'est d'apporter le même triple A à des state-owned entities. Alors que là, on va un petit peu plus loin, c'est-à-dire qu'on va vers des entreprises publiques. C'est-à-dire, prenons un cas qui n'est pas ici pour éviter de personnaliser, prenons Eskom. Eskom en Afrique du Sud, eh bien, nous pourrions, subject to 3 conditions que je vais citer, apporter notre garantie triple A à un prêt fait par des banques commerciales à Eskom. Pour ça, il faut que l'entreprise en question remplisse 3 conditions, que ce soit une entreprise publique, enfin détenue par l'État, détenue et contrôlée par l'État, je pense que c'est le cas d'Eskom, 2, qu'elle remplisse une mission de service public, et 3, qu'elle soit creditworthy. Pourquoi il faut qu'elle soit creditworthy, c'est-à-dire bancable, pour faire simple? Parce que nous nous appuyons sur son bilan pour prendre le risque. Donc il ne faut pas que... Nous ne demandons pas à l'État qui est actionnaire d'apporter une lettre de garantie, c'est le bilan seul de l'entreprise publique qui nous... Alors, ces deux produits créent un changement de donne, c'est-à-dire autorisent des États suffisamment... qui ont un rating suffisant. Alors, en Afrique, par exemple, le Maroc est un État qui fonctionne de ce point de vue, pour nous, qui est la Tunisie, le Ghana, l'Afrique du Sud, bien entendu, le Botswana, je ne peux pas tous les citer, mais il y a quand même un certain nombre de pays africains qui sont éligibles à cette garantie AAA non-honoring. Pour les entreprises publiques, on démarre. Donc on est en train de, comme nous sommes des assureurs et pas des banquiers, il faut qu'on apprenne un peu à définir la creditworthiness des entreprises publiques. On a un petit peu de travail à faire, mais on va le faire avec des banquiers commerciaux. Donc voilà comment nous, pratiquement, si vous voulez, on débloque des verrous pour aider au financement des infrastructures. Je dirais un dernier point, enfin, qui concerne les gens des transports, c'est que dans une opération qu'on a faite en Côte d'Ivoire, on a garanti un revenu minimum à l'opérateur. C'est très important, c'était un pont à péage. Donc on a garanti que l'État ivoirien apportait un revenu minimum à l'opérateur et nous avons contre-garanti ce revenu minimum. Là aussi, c'est un élément important de décision pour le sponsor et pour le banquier. Voilà, je vous remercie.
Thomas, quickly back to you.
Yes, I wanted to comment a little bit on what Alstom said, and I think it's extremely important what was said first, that life cycle costs should be really driving an assessment of a good project. And secondly, urban transport shows us, how important the role of the local or the national government is in making these projects happen. Because most urban transport projects rely on a part payment for services by the public sector. And so sometimes the misconception is that when the private sector comes in, the private sector takes all the risk and does everything in an isolated way. And the cases of Casablanca and Rabat show, in fact, that a successful infrastructure project needs this very, very close cooperation between the private sector delivering efficient services and the public sector through a public service obligation contract, through other legally enforceable long-term instruments to provide certainty or near certainty for financiers to come in and then provide the funding necessary to implement these investments.
Bruno, I'm giving it back to you, and I'm throwing in a question as well. Coming from DEG, how do we go on to organize a pipeline of bankable projects and the risks that go with them? And what can be the particular role of IFIs in bringing African projects to bankability?
Yes, Frederick. Before I answer the question, let me focus on one topic you mentioned, the telecommunications sector in Africa, and let's reflect what happened there, and whether it would be possible also to draw on the lessons learned in the telecommunications sector. When the private sector started to finance the telecommunications sector back in the beginning of the, I think it was 2002 or 2003, the telecommunications sector in Africa was hardly existing. So there were only a few fixed lines, and the public sector utilities were not very efficient in doing that. But they started to do that, making use of new technology available, mobile phones. And in 2003 and 2004, we as DFI, we approached the sector and saying, why it's not possible for you also to enlarge the system beyond the urban areas? And I said, no, we can't do that because there are too much risk involved, and we do not believe that at the end the people will pay. So there is no cash flow available for us. So we said, this is our role as DFIs, we will help you. So today we see that everybody almost has a mobile phone. The penetration in the telecommunications sector in Africa is almost the highest in all regions. And the people are paying. And we have a regulatory framework which is very much conducive, which is enabling the private sector to do business. We have countries like Ghana that we have six providers. I think it's a little bit overdone for a population of 15. But nevertheless, there's a lot of pressure, a lot of competition to reduce costs. And this is why then also the Asian providers are coming into Africa with some kind of new business models. So what we can learn? Do we have in other infrastructure sectors like energy or water, do we have the right regulatory framework? No. Do we have a willingness to pay? No. This morning we have discussed extensively on the energy sector. There's a need to do more, but we also have discussed the high subsidies. There are only a few countries in Africa, and fortunately Morocco is one of the few examples. They have tariffs in place which reflect more or less the economic cost of generation, transmission, distribution. So there is no incentive for the private sector to come in because there are too much subsidies involved. So they cannot get a decent return for the risks they are taking. The second problem is if we then feed into the grid. In most of the African countries, we are confronted with power utilities which are almost bankrupt. I always cite the example of TANESCO in Tanzania. I'm now 32 years in business, and since 32 years are dealing with TANESCO, and nothing happened. So there is no incentive system for the private sector to come in. Do you expect that the private sector is then accepting a power purchase agreement with a power utility, which they do not expect that they will honor the contract? So this is why I think also we have to discuss what we can do, and I call also on our colleagues then from MIGA, because they can do a lot in leveraging more private sector activity simply by guaranteeing then these power purchase agreements. And then the people are coming in. And this is why if this enabling environment is in place, then it's easy to start with feasibility studies, making projects bankable. Because making project bankable doesn't limit, it's not limited simply to have a technical feasibility study and then some kind of financial projection and so on. No, you have to take into account the regulatory framework. And if the regulatory framework is not in place, then the risks are extremely high. Then we have to ask ourselves how we can mitigate these risks. So this is what we always mean with bankability. And in terms of bankability, we in DEG, we are very proud that our still existing government, we were able to convince them to provide us with a lot of funds so that we can finance making projects bankable. But I know also that a lot of other development banks have a lot of money and this is being invested. The second problem, I think, in establishing this kind of pipelines of suitable projects, also that we need some pioneers, that we need some project developer. For example, we as DEG, we are shareholder of a platform we have with Aga Khan in West Africa and also in East Africa. And this platform is being used to develop projects which the private sector normally is not willing to do. For example, we are now developing a power project which requires the permission of the government of Burundi, of Rwanda and DRC. And this can only be done then by some kind of project developer. This morning we had a lot of debates on renewable energies. Yes, there's a lot of potential, but once again we need also then project developer who are ready to develop these projects. And this is extremely risky business. So once again, if you do not have the regulatory framework in place, nobody is doing that. Because if you are investing with the probability that only 1 out of 10 projects will be successful, then nobody is investing there. So making projects bankable and then developing projects, especially in the energy sector, these are keys. And this is what we actually are doing. This, for example, not in Africa yet, because we do not see that the regulatory framework is in place, but in Latin America, we are shareholders of a lot of project developers in the wind industry, in the solar industry, and so on. And this is a big success, and I hope that based on the best experience in Latin America, in Europe, and elsewhere, we have a lot of, let me say, best practice we can easily replicate in Africa, provided that the regulatory framework is in place.
We just touched the subject of platforms for infrastructures, Hatem, and the African Development Bank has launched quite a fascinating initiative called Sokoni, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically the first online marketplace for infrastructure projects in Africa, and which to me is a brilliant example of how technology can be brought to play the role of an enabler as it has done in many other sectors. Could you tell us a little bit more, just really quickly, about this initiative and how the bank anticipates that technology could be a game changer in the infrastructure sector?
Thanks. Yes, the Sokoni was an initiative that the World Bank actually was not the originator, but involved in and liked the idea and would like to develop it. It's pretty much really a matchmaking, a dating, almost like a dating agency, really trying to link the investors with the sort of project sponsors or champions. The idea is there are a number of investors out there looking for opportunities, but there are also a number of sponsors trying to push projects which they're either probably half prepared, half ready, or they're not, or they are ready, but they couldn't actually see the investors. That's obviously the lack of capacity. And it's actually by putting these two together in a marketplace, sort of virtual marketplace, you create competition among the sponsors themselves, so they can actually improve on the way they present their project and they prepare them. But also you create competition among the investors, so that actually can get good deals for those sponsors projects. So that's really the objective of the facility. Obviously, the facility will need a lot of these PPP, particularly privately financed projects, involve a lot of confidentiality issues. So we're still working on that aspect, actually, how to get that to work and who you allow, who you do not allow, and all that things. But that's pretty much, in a nutshell, the principle.
I mean, you just touched the subject of competition, which I think is very interesting, and that brings me to my next thought, which is directed to Louis. You know, when it comes to infrastructure in Africa, does the arrival of a whole new set of actors, be it for the private sector or for the public sector, the arrival of a whole new set of actors from emerging economies, I'm thinking China, Brazil, India, does it change the landscape of infrastructure for Africa? And I have in mind, does it change the landscape for governments and for currently active private actors?
Oui, bien sûr. C'est vrai qu'il y a une quinzaine d'années à peu près, l'Afrique, c'était une chasse gardée, disons, de l'Europe, pour faire simple, de quelques pays européens, et puis c'est tout. Et puis ce qu'on constate, mais c'est une banalité, hein, c'est que les Indiens, les Chinois, les Brésiliens sont arrivés, j'en oublie certainement, mais enfin ceux-là sont arrivés en force. Alors évidemment, ça suscite quelquefois des réactions diverses. Hein. D'abord, disons, une certaine méfiance devant des méthodes qui ne sont pas tout à fait les méthodes standards, on va dire. Des méfiances aussi sur je veux dire, la manière de traiter les questions environnementales et sociales, la manière de traiter les questions de concurrence, la manière de traiter les indicateurs de qualité et de durabilité des ouvrages. Mais bon, si vous voulez le sentiment de la banque, hein, le sentiment de la banque, c'est que sans fleurs s'épanouissent, hein, comme disait quelqu'un qui s'appelait Mao Tse-tung. Hein, je veux dire, la concurrence, elle est toujours bonne. Et je pense que les rentes de situation, c'est pas bon non plus. Donc, quand des opérateurs du Sud, pour les appeler ainsi, hein, je pense au Brésil, arrivent dans l'Afrique lusophone, quand les Chinois arrivent dans toute l'Afrique de l'Ouest ou de l'Est, quand les Indiens essayent de s'implanter, s'ils peuvent favoriser des infrastructures à des coûts très inférieurs, ou s'ils peuvent stimuler la concurrence, ben écoutez, franchement, nous, on s'en plaint pas. On s'en plaint pas pour autant que, évidemment, les contraintes environnementales et sociales auxquelles on tient beaucoup soient respectées, que les appels d'offres soient faits dans les règles. C'est vrai qu'on n'aime pas les gré à gré. Bon, c'est vrai, un gré à gré entre un gouvernement et puis un pays africain, on n'aime pas trop. On n'aime pas trop les échanges voies ferrées contre minerais. Bon, on n'aime pas trop non plus. Mais je veux dire, ceci étant dit, je pense que certains pays d'Afrique sont très contents d'avoir des alternatives. Maintenant, chacun doit défendre ses positions. Je comprends très bien que des grands opérateurs, des grands suppliers du Nord, je dirais pas se plaignent, mais trouvent que la concurrence est ardue, que les armes ne sont pas égales, que les coûts du travail ne sont pas les mêmes. Mais je suis désolé, c'est la vie des affaires. Hein. On en a profité, nous, pendant des siècles. Peut-être que la roue tourne un peu. Lisez le dernier rapport de l'Agence internationale de l'énergie qui est sorti il y a quelques jours. Il dit bien que le futur, une partie du futur du monde quand même va se déplacer vers, enfin c'est une évidence, vers la Chine, vers l'Inde, que les États-Unis bien sûr vont garder leur rôle dominant, mais qu'en matière énergétique en particulier, le pays le producteur le plus important risque d'être l'Inde, le pays consommateur le plus important risque d'être la Chine. Donc il y a un petit déplacement du centre de gravité, ça veut dire que ces pays vont devenir de plus en plus forts dans ces chasses gardées africaines. Mais écoutez, bon, tant mieux. Nous, on est là pour essayer modestement de jouer des rôles avec nos amis de la BAD, avec d'autres multilatéraux, bilatéraux, de jouer des rôles de garde-fous. Mais on n'empêche pas les fous, si je puis dire. Hein. Je veux dire, nous sommes des garde-fous, je veux dire, mais on est là pour mettre des barrières et des protections, pour faire en sorte qu'un certain nombre de normes soient respectées. Mais n'oubliez jamais, in fine, ce sont les pays qui décident, pas nous. Ce n'est pas la Banque mondiale qui décide, ce n'est pas la Banque africaine, ce ne sont pas mes deux collègues de la Banque européenne ou de DEG qui décident, ce sont des États souverains qui font leur choix. Il ne faut pas l'oublier.
I want to turn to you guys very quickly to take some questions. So if you have any, have them at the ready. Somebody will go through the room with a mic and we'd be delighted to have your input. But before I do that, I wanted to have Tran's reaction. You know, Louis said competition is always good. Do you see things eye to eye at Alstom?
Yes, I agree. I agree competition is always good. And I agree with Mr. Bedoucha when he says that it's very sane to have newcomers coming, newcomers with new ways of working, ways of proposing new solutions. So we have to adapt, really, because we have, let's say, another way. We have been working another way for the 10, 20, 30 past years. And today, clearly, we have to change our way of seeing things. So we have to create the tools and have the right spec in before the tenders come out. We have, for instance, to try to find a way to valorize our technicity, our technology, our quality of R&D, for instance, that we put in our materials, in our infrastructures, in our trains, our metros, in our VHS, whatever. So we have to find ways and tools to valorize that. This through evaluation schemes, for instance, in the tenders. And we have to find a way, too, to find new leverages, for instance, co-localization, open factories in the countries, create workforce, have a transfer of knowledge, things like that. And there are recent examples that we can evoke today, which are today in South Africa, where the model of renovation of those 1,500 trains, which were transporting every day more than 2 million of passengers, all aging trains, thanks to a very voluntaristic and pushy politics in South Africa, came to launch a competition where we could valorize our technology through the creation of factories and transfer of know-how. So there are some tools there where we can compete. And I agree that we have to change our old-fashioned and our old minds that sometimes prevail still in our old companies. And there is a big boss that I'm sure you have heard of, who wrote this famous book about dancing of the elephant. So we are all elephants. I am personally also an elephant, even if I'm small, but I'm working for a company where sometimes we are behaving like elephants, but we have to find an agile style. We have to find a way to address to those new governments, new ways of buying, new procurement laws, and accompany them to say that, yes, we can change. And so in this regard, I agree that competition is a good way for us also to move towards that.
Very quickly, Bruno, and then Hatem on this question.
I would like to remind ourselves that we are part of the problem, because we have contributed to the problem here in Africa. We are just discussing, because I remember that in 1992 our colleagues from the World Bank were very dogmatic and saying there is no need anymore for development banks to be involved in infrastructure because the private sector can take it up. And if you look into the OECD statistics of the Development Assistance Committee, you can see a sharp reduction in the commitments of the donor community to infrastructure. And this is more or less then also reflected in a sharp reduction of infrastructure spending also by African countries. So we are part of the problem. So this was to some extent a misguided policy. And emerging countries like China, they have used this gap created by us. Also having in mind that China Chinese development policy internally is heavily focusing on infrastructure, because this is what they are doing, and it is extremely successful. So infrastructure, and then they came with a completely different approach, because to some extent we were always asking for studies and studies and studies and studies and studies, and to some extent it took us sometimes years to be in a position to say, yes, we can go for an appraisal. To some extent, this is unacceptable for governments which are pushed also by more urban development in Africa. And so, at the end, we have not delivered. And this is why I think this kind of competition is extremely good, because it reminds ourselves also to reflect on the way we are doing business, the way we are listening to partners, because when it comes to Africa and development assistance, we always have the notion that we are partners, but only in 2007 in Glen Eagles, when UK had the G8 presidency, there was once again a reflection that we need to change our mindset and that we have to help the African partners to do more in the infrastructure. So it should remind ourselves that hopefully, since we are part of the problem, that we are also part of the solution.
Do you see things eye to eye at the African Development Bank?
Yes, actually, Bruno said it all. I mean, definitely, I can't agree more that actually we, as a development partner, we also have to change the way we do things. We should be more client-oriented. We should expedite the way we do business, the way we process those projects. Our processes are inherently long and often miss the opportunity, I'm afraid. They're also so complex that sometimes create lots of constraints and actually reduce the opportunity for innovation. So this is something really we have also to ourselves to improve, being pushed by competition from the Chinese. And also in terms of quality of the service we render, it's not just about giving money or advancing money basically for building it. It's also positioning ourselves in a high added value service to the country, things like advisory. We should be able to advise the country to be a knowledge bank that really provide enlightening to the countries, help transfer the expertise and the know-how to those countries to help them really develop. It's not just about the sort of the classical traditional financing. We have to be moving as well. The other element I think is my colleague said is through competition that actually we can benefit from the value chain. Private sector tend to be, to seek, they are private, they're looking for opportunities. Unless they are shaked and pushed, they will not really look for optimizing their processes. But actually, when you put them in competition, that's when they actually team up with other private sector so they can use the competitive advantage of each party in actually providing a product that is more efficient and actually less more affordable. And that, in a sense, also important because it helps the regional integration, for example. Across countries, you may sometimes need to fragment the production so that you actually benefit from the comparative advantage of every country and then assemble them together. And that help trade across countries. So it serves a lot of purposes at the same time. There has been another element that my colleague Luis touched on earlier, and he prompted me when he said about he doesn't like the idea of the infrastructure against the mining. I'm not really fully sure about that because that's a concept that we're really very interested on in the African Development Bank, and I think our colleagues in the World Bank as well, is this concept of resource corridors that is actually gaining momentum. And I hate to say it, but this is how the colonial powers helped develop more infrastructure than the African government are able today. That's how the colonial power themselves got developed. If you look at Canada, for example, that's how they developed their land. Is they don't have cash to actually build these heavy infrastructure, hungry in capital. When they went back to their colonial countries to actually ask for funding to build those infrastructure, they had to back against assets. They didn't have any assets. The only assets was actually the future revenues that are going to be generated from those mining ores or whatever resources they're going to exploit. So it's actually based on that future revenue. They sort of limited the recourse really financing. And that's how Africa can develop. A lot of these infrastructure are extremely costly. You know, to build 100 kilometers of railways, it could cost up to $1 billion. Now, these are a small economy, let's not forget, very fragile states. Even with all the goodwill of all the donors, we cannot really gather more money than, I mean, they have limited capacity of, of borrowing. And so you cannot really rely on their current balance sheet, country balance sheet, to be able to build infrastructure. You're going to have to rethink how to package those projects with the natural resources. Things like Africa is a wealthy continent. It's full of natural resources, but they're not exploited because there is no infrastructure. So we're in a catch-22. Somehow you have to really repackage those so that actually a concession and not coming just to exploit the mining resources, which we can estimate pretty much in a very level detail how much revenue they're going to generate over the next 20 or 30 years. But then also ask them to build the railway, to build the port, to ship those products, and also to build probably a hydropower station and a factory to actually to smelter or whatever to actually transform those projects and add value to them in the country before shipping them instead of shipping raw materials. If you package all that in one PPP, then the private sector will be cashing the revenues from the mining, but not actually going. They're only getting a few profit, and all that money going to pay back the lenders for those infrastructure. That saves the money from going into the budget and disappearing. So it's actually directly targeting the sort of ring-fenced for that infrastructure. So it's those new concepts that are gaining momentum, and obviously they're complex, they're big aspects, and not forget the African governments have those capacity problems. We also don't know how to do these things, how to raise such big investment. And really this is something that is, to me, is the future. It's not well done, I mean, as my colleague Louis said, by the Chinese today, because obviously, it's done in an unpackaged way or more sort of in an implicit way. If we can formalize those concepts and help the government in developing them, I think it can yield a great opportunities for the expediting the infrastructure deployment in the African continent.
Before I turn back to you, I would just like to look at the room and see if anybody among you has any questions that they would like to address to our panelists. It's always interesting to see if you have any questions that you would like the panelists to address. If so, kindly raise your hand and the mic will be on its way.
Thank you. My name is Nabil Saimi from Moroccan Agency for Solar Energy. Thank you for the insights. My questions goes to Mr. Wen and Mr. Bedrusha. So the first one, you mentioned that limited the regulatory framework to support the developers. So in Africa, I was just wondering if you can just develop a little bit on that, what is really missing, and what's going on in Latin America, for example, that you mentioned. And the second thing is regarding the development of African country as a whole, a real development by creating sustainable jobs. So I don't know if there is any report that is mentioning or analyzing for each dollar from development banks invested in Africa, how much sustainable jobs have been really created. Because we see, it seems like some of the limitation for local content, for example, are not, in a sense, helping the countries to develop. Just to make sure, what is the real objectives of those development banks? Is it short-term equipment acquisition, or is it sustainable development? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can take a second question for our panelists, if there is one. And if there isn't, I'll give it back to Bruno to answer.
With regards to jobs is one of the major indicator of measuring development impact for DFIs. And I can inform you that very recently, at the occasion of the annual World Bank meetings, we have signed a memorandum of understanding, 27 DFIs and IFIs. We have agreed on a joint package of development indicators and also on the methodology, so that in the future, when we report on jobs, then then you know what kind of definition we are using. And at the same time, we have agreed upon to join forces to go for a larger job study worldwide. Why? Because so far our methodology is very good when it comes to counting the direct the job impact. Because it's easy, because our clients, they report back. So for example, if you finance a power station, then they report back the number of staff they have. But it's only a small impact. So what we are looking for is a multiplier which is justified and evidenced by a huge worldwide study, so that we can easily say when we are financing a power station, then we have a multiplier for XYZ in terms of indirect employment through the use of the power generated. This is not yet available. For example, we as European Development Finance Institute last year, we undertook a joint evaluation study of three power projects here in Africa with the help of universities, and they have employed a lot of students and so on. So they have done field studies, real field studies. And they found out that we have completely underestimated the indirect development employment impact. And this is, I hope that we will be better in the future in reporting not only the direct job impacts, but also the indirect development impact. What I mean with regulatory framework, for example, in the case of Latin America, it's easy for project developer because they develop, let me say, a mini hydro site. They acquire the water rights. They make their first proposals, and they can do it the same with wind and solar. And then the regulator, they're always coming out with tenders and saying, we now looking for 20 megawatt of new power, and we will pay you $120 per megawatt hour. For example, as recently in the case of Peru. So that they can easily submit their tender, and if they succeed, then they have 2 years' time to develop. And if they do not succeed to do it within the 2 years specified in the tender procedure, then they have to pay fines to the regulator. This has now been, very recently, this has now been replicated in South Africa with tremendous success. There are a huge amount of private sector people now coming out with new project proposals for renewable energies. And we as DEG, together with other European DFIs, we have helped them to do that. Because once again, it's extremely costly. You have to buy the land, you have to buy the water rights if it's hydro and so on. So you have to provide initial investments. And this is always more risky if this regulative framework is not in place. If you know all the parameters of the tender procedure, if you know how it's happening, if you have a lot of confidence that the tender procedure is fair and transparent, then it reduces dramatically the risk of a project developer. If you do not have this system in place, then you develop something, but you really do not know whether at the end you will succeed. So the probability of failure is extremely high, and this is why at the end the probability that you lose money is also very high. This is why then the private sector is not taking up. So this is what I meant, trying to define the right regulator framework in order to reduce the risk of the private sector to be engaged in project development.
If there is no further question from the audience, I'd like to turn to another, or to the second part of our reflection here, which was there is a question? Oh, by all means.
My question deals with the organizational side of this conference. By having a glance at the identity of the guests, we can make sure that the economic superpowers in the Virgin continent are equally represented, except for the presence of the USA. I wonder why the USA is absent from this conference.
That is a question we'll leave with the organizers. I guess it. Any other questions? Then, if we turn back to this idea, to this division in infrastructures between the private and the public sector, I think there's a lot to be said there, and this is really an interesting subject. If I turn to you, Thomas, you know, you've helped Eastern European countries reform their economic organizations after the fall of communism. When you consider that experience in Eastern Europe, what is the good division of labor between the private and the public sector when it comes to providing basic infrastructure such as water or such as electricity?
It's a very difficult and emotive question, and I think you can't answer it quite like that, because I was smiling when Mr. Wen explained how difficult it was initially to get the private sector interested in telecommunications, because in Romania 20 years ago we were heavily involved in the privatization of the fixed line state operator, and then bringing in a lot of mobile operators with great success. And it was interesting to see that the population was really willing to pay for mobile services, actually compared to income, extraordinary amounts. But when we tried to go into the water industry and bring private investment into the water industry, the same people, the willingness to pay simply wasn't there at that time, because at that time the perception still was water is something that needs to be provided free of charge. And so I think it depends a little bit on the sector. And in Romania over the years, we have actually dealt with things in a sequential way. And we've worked with about 25, 30 small and medium-sized municipalities. And in each and every case, we tried successively accompany investments with adjustments in tariffs. And now when you look at the water industry as a whole, it's a 22 million people country, Romania. You know, we started off with a sector that was worth probably not more than 300 million euro a year. It is now a sector that is close to 1.8 billion and has a lot of potential to generate additional cash. And we now see that the private sector is getting interested, because the key problem of willingness to pay could be overcome. But again, the lesson here is it's a 20-year horizon we are looking at. These things don't happen overnight. A similar way in our countries, heating generation is extremely expensive. And it took us many, many years to adjust and improve the regulatory framework, to then subsequently bring in domestic and international private sectors to deliver improved services.
Hadam, do you think there is readiness in the general public? Because the public, in the end, I mean, the citizens are an integral part of the success or the failure of private sector involvement in essential services as well. Is there readiness, to your mind, from the citizens in Africa to see the water sector, the electricity sector go into private hands?
To me, I think it's there are some cultural hurdles, particularly if you look at countries from the ex-Eastern Bloc, that they were used to the public sector, like my colleague said earlier, free of charge, and there is obviously a hurdle, and it takes time for them to accept the fact that all these public services you have to pay for, the road, the water, the energy, the telephone, and so on. In the case of Africa, I don't think it is an issue, because in the few cases that we came across where the private sector was involved, there hasn't been such a problem. Where the problem comes is when the tariff that actually for acquiring that service is unaffordable, then there is a problem. But whether the operator is a private sector or public sector, I don't think the ordinary citizen cares much. Where obviously there is another issue is when you begin privatizing public services, then you begin cutting jobs for efficiency. That also may cause a bit of friction. But then obviously that has to be seen within a wider concept that the private sector, when you bring in a private sector, you shouldn't just bring them to actually manage or operate that facility or that parastatal. You have to think of it from a wider perspective, that actually that private sector will, by improving the efficiency, they can also generate more revenues and invest in other industries or other facilities that can actually create more jobs than moving in the. So they're there for the efficiency. The private sector, I think the big mistake that we see often when we speak to politicians, and even my previous life and I worked for private sector, when you go and see the politician, they want to do that project or they want to sell that facility because they don't have money. They need bridging the financing gap. And that's the biggest mistake. I mean, you don't bring the private sector to finance. The private sector are more expensive than the public sector borrowing. So that's true everywhere in the world, unless obviously you involve the multilateral guarantees, such as in MEGA case. But otherwise, in most cases, they are more expensive. Where the private sector is useful in actually improving the efficiency, the reduction in the cost due to the efficiency, also through the innovation that bring in new technology and constantly modernizing the facilities, that actually the gain you get from that is actually offset the extra cost of finance that actually may have. And that's the balance that you have to see. If you don't get that balance, you'd better finance it the old way in the public sector. So it's really this logic that has to be understood by the governments. Now, the other element, if I may, and is a bit really linked to the regulation aspect. If you don't have the right regulation in the country and you bring in the private sector, what's going to happen? I mean, you build a new power station. What's going to happen? In a new technology, you bring in new technology. You will reduce the cost of production. You'll have extra profit. Unless there is competition, that profit that will remain with the producer. It's the producer surplus will remain with the producer. So to be able to transfer that surplus into the users, you need to have such competition. And a good competition means good regulation of the market. And unless you have that, there will be a milking cow, for the private sector, taking all that money, and the end users will not see any difference, other than the price is going up without the service improving. So it's that perspective that has to be looked at, I believe.
Tran, there's a question I wanted to ask you. I believe we're not leveraging enough on the private sector's experience. I mean, when you listen to private actors in Africa, it seems to me that they often complain of not being associated enough in public decision making when it comes to infrastructure projects, because the private sector, when you look at it, has experience in terms of identifying opportunities, in terms of conceiving the financing, of realizing the projects. How, to your mind, can the private sector be more involved in designing and planning key infrastructure projects?
It's a difficult question because as constructors, we are not associated directly to the qualifications that the governments are doing. But still we are having a sort of lobbying with the engineering companies. Because in the chain, before and prior to launch a tender, there is 5, 10, 15, sometimes more years of investigations and studying going on. And those studies are not made by the industrials. They are made by engineering companies who are studying and paid through specific fundings, engineering fundings, those studies. And those studies are, of course, cross-checked by the industrials. I take an example. In 2014-15, will be launched in Morocco the new elevated light metro for Casablanca. And today Casablanca has appointed, well, first has launched a tender to appoint the engineering company who is going to lead the studies. So they worked 6 or 8 months in order to evaluate which company was due to assist them in order to write the tendering specification. So they have chosen an engineering company after a process, a normal evaluation process. And this engineering company today has its own idea of what could be and what should be the technology for this high new light elevated metro in Casablanca. Still, the work of the engineering company is to convoke all the industrial companies and to have them describe their portfolio, their innovations, their specificities, their prices, their performances, their well, whatever can help them to write a request for proposal, which in due time, which will be concretely for next year, will be used for the tendering phase. So indeed, the industrials are, let's say, co-involved in some kind of decision, but not enough, I agree with you. But I would say there is another person which is absolutely not co-involved in the decision. It's the end user. Today, for us, the end user is the passenger who is buying his ticket, who is assessing if the mean of transport, or sorry, I am focusing on the rail, but who is assessing if the means of transportation is reliable, is clean, is smelling good, is regular, is quick enough, is cheap enough. And this end user today is only, let's say, solicited after and once the system of transportation is installed. So he is then, through polls, etc., asked to assess what is the quality of the service he is having. But upstream, I'm not sure that these key users are solicited, at least in this region. Just to come back to the Istanbul metro, so I discovered that, thank you, Louis, you helped us to win the first metro line in Istanbul in the 90s, and then the second one, because we didn't win all, as you say. But in Istanbul, for instance, the means of transport are much more developed, and the end users are associated. They can tell what quality they want, and that's the reason why you have a really heavy network developed there. You have not only metros, but you have suburban trains, you have buses, you have low-speed buses, you have high-speed buses, you have shuttles to the airports, you have a lot of, let's say, networking. So what could be the solution for that is maybe come back to this platform of engineering, let's say, and cross this platform, this banking platform of development with engineering companies who today are working on their own technically with their clients. Then you have the industrials working on their own, one-to-one with their clients or their potential clients, and then one-to-one with the bankers. Maybe one idea could be to merge these three parties in this banking platform, from which I understand is an innovation in the banking sector.
Bruno, you wanted to add something?
I would like to add that we as European Development Finance Institute, we appreciate and welcome very much that the African Union is now embarked on a program to do more of these kind of business business dialogues with the help of the African Development Bank and also the European Union, because we believe very, very much that is a key. because this helps very much that there's a better understanding developed over time, that the public sector better understand what the private sector can do and what the private sector can't do. Because there's always a perception by the public sector that the private companies, they're always looking for profits. Yes, they're looking for profits because they're also taking huge risk. But at the same time, it comes back to how to structure the regulation. If you go for a tender, for concession, for example, for water supply, and that it's clearly spelled out that you as a private sector, you have to provide water to the very poor at a highly subsidized rate. And you will, and that's part of your performance contract, and they will do some kind of client service and on in order to find out whether you actually deliver also in terms of quality, then they will do that. And they will come out with a lot of innovative ideas to do that with less costs. So making use of this kind of expertise the private sector can bring in. Because the private sector, when they take over a water plant, the first thing they will do is they do leakage control. Because also in Africa, in most water supply systems, there's water leakages of over 40 to 50%. Water which has already been produced, but is lost. So making use of this kind of water, you can generate much more supply also to the very poor. And at the same time, also the private sector better understand what the public sector can do and what the public sector can offer. And that through this kind of dialogue, we can then generate some kind of a better understanding. And what we as European Development Finance Institutes are arguing very much, that also in this kind of dialogue we should include non-governmental organizations. Because non-governmental organizations, also in my country, in Germany, are always once a week I have dialogue with non-governmental organizations because they are complaining that we are doing that and not that and so on. So this is also very much important to generate some kind of a consensus on the role of the public sector and on the role of the private sector. And once again, the private sector can do a lot, but also the private sector can't do a lot. And it is completely nonsense always to ask the private sector to do something where the government failed. For example, usually then the private sector will be called in if a water supply system is not operating since many years, or if the infrastructure is being run down, like railways and so on. Then you cannot expect that almost overnight the private sector can turn this plant or this railway into a success story. It needs many years. Why I tell you that? Because we have invested. It's a high-risk investment in a railway system in Kenya and in Uganda. And it's a railway line from Mombasa through Nairobi to Kampala. When the private sector took over this railway system, it was completely run down. And it took locomotives more than 2 months from Mombasa to Kampala and back to Mombasa. And today they have succeeded to cut it to 20 days, which is still a nightmare because there are still thousands of containers stuck in Kampala or Nairobi, and we have to bring them back to Mombasa. But this once again shows that the private sector is willing to take risk if they can make a real judgment on the risk. And this once again is a question of getting the enabling environment right. And this is why this kind of dialogue between the public sector and the private sector is crucial.
Before we bring this discussion to an end, there was one last question from the audience that we wanted to take. If a microphone could be provided to the front. Just a second.
Bonjour. Ma question va être posée en français, mais c'est en relation avec la Banque du développement africain. J'aimerais bien savoir et avoir quelques éléments de réponse par rapport à la politique de financement des projets de développement au niveau de l'Afrique de la part de la Banque africaine du développement, tout en prenant en considération la gestion des risques et aussi cette condition de prêt avec des conditions. Donc j'aimerais bien avoir des éléments de réponse par rapport à votre politique de développement des projets de développement au niveau local, c'est-à-dire au niveau de l'Afrique. Merci.
Can I answer in French? Bon, tout d'abord, notre mission, c'est une mission de développement essentiellement. Donc, notre objectif est la définition, la priorisation des projets, la conception même des projets doit démontrer clairement l'objectif de développement. Cependant, quand on fait le due diligence, quand on fait on va dans les détails des projets, on voit qu'il y a certains éléments qui sont externes au projet, mais qui sont importants, problématiques importantes à régler, sans quoi le projet lui-même ne fonctionnera pas. Je donne un petit exemple, par exemple. On peut construire une route. Un pays approche la Banque africaine de développement pour développer une route, ou on va dire un port. D'accord, on peut construire l'infrastructure, mais demain, il y aura très peu de, comme disait mon collègue, l'exemple du port de Mombasa, les bateaux arrivent, il y a tellement de bureaucratie, il y a tellement de problèmes, il y a problème de gouvernance, il y a problème d'incohérence et des services de réglementation des douanières, il y a tellement de problématiques qui fait que on n'arrive pas à acheminer les commodités. Ce qui fait que le port, en fait, fonctionnera à 20 ou 30% de sa capacité pour laquelle il a été conçu. Tout ça, c'est de l'investissement qui est perdu. Et donc, nous, on attache à l'accord de prêt ou de don, ça dépend des cas, on attache des conditionnalités. C'est des conditionnalités focalisées essentiellement au bon fonctionnement du projet. Donc, c'est vraiment toujours dans l'objectif de s'assurer que les objectifs ultimes des projets, qui sont les objectifs de développement socio-économique, sont atteints. Maintenant, il y a des fois des conditionnalités qui sortent du cadre du projet lui-même, mais en fait, qui touchent à l'ensemble de tous les secteurs. Par exemple, on peut utiliser un projet d'infrastructure pour demander des réformes au niveau des ministères, par exemple. Le ministère ne fait pas que ce projet-là, il fait plusieurs autres projets, plusieurs autres initiatives. On construit une route, par exemple, et on demande au ministère de réglementer le secteur du transport. A priori, réglementation des opérateurs de transport. Ce n'est pas vraiment lié directement à l'infrastructure, mais sans quoi le marché de transport ne sera pas performant, ne fonctionnera pas bien, et donc aussi l'infrastructure ne servira pas à grand-chose. Donc c'est toujours vraiment des objectifs focalisés sur l'intérêt de développement économique. Voilà.
Time has flown by, and I'd like us to come to a conclusion on this topic that we've tried to tackle today. I'd like Louis to give us some concluding remarks, trying to sum up what has been said today and what we can expect for the future.
Alors, moi, je vais faire très simple. Hein. Je vais vous dire, on est une grande essoreuse. Vous voyez ce que c'est qu'une essoreuse? Vous voyez, ça tourne et ça sélectionne et tout ça. Bon. Et donc, notre métier à tous, là, c'est l'essoreuse. Alors, à l'entrée de l'essoreuse, il y a plein de projets qui arrivent. Plein. Il y en a plein qui arrivent. Je vous assure, sur l'Afrique, si je vous dis un par semaine, je suis en dessous de la réalité. Et puis, à la sortie de l'essoreuse, il en reste évidemment pas un par semaine. Il en reste un sérieux tous les 2 mois, tous les mois. Alors, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Ça veut dire que les bons projets, ils arrivent au bout. Et les mauvais projets, ils passent même pas dans l'essoreuse, ils rentrent même pas dans l'essoreuse. Alors, qu'est-ce que c'est qu'un mauvais projet? Qu'est-ce que c'est qu'un bon projet? Je vais vous donner des exemples de mauvais projets. Bon, un projet de 47 gigawatts d'hydro dans un pays complètement pourri, c'est un mauvais projet. Je ne dirai pas où ça se passe, évidemment. Un projet d'1,5 milliard de dollars qui représente 3 fois le PIB du pays, c'est un mauvais projet. Bon. Un projet d'énergie renouvelable où il faut que l'État local subventionne massivement la différence entre le prix de sortie et le prix payé par l'utilisateur. Est-ce que c'est soutenable? Je n'en sais rien. Alors, je ne peux pas vous dire où se passent ces projets, mais ces projets, ils existent, hein, c'est des vrais projets dont je vous parle. Et puis les bons projets, c'est des projets, c'est comme les églises et les mosquées, hein, pour que ça tienne, il faut que c'est à peu près une forme standard. Vous ne verrez jamais une mosquée de 500 mètres de haut et 10 mètres de large. Tout le monde sait que ça va tomber, quoi. Eh bien, je suis désolé, les projets, c'est comme les mosquées, les cathédrales ou les églises ou les synagogues. Il y a des règles de l'art. Les règles de l'art, c'est que le projet doit être dimensionné par rapport au pays, il doit avoir un sens, une utilité économique et sociale, il doit avoir un financement, il doit avoir un bon sponsor, il doit avoir un bon supplier. Et notre métier à tous, ici, autour de cette table, c'est de faire en sorte que, d'une part, que le projet qui n'est pas si beau que ça au début, ben, il puisse arriver à sortir de l'essoreuse à peu près correctement. Et puis, notre métier aussi, c'est de dire quelquefois à des sponsors, écoutez, votre truc ne vole pas, laissez tomber, arrêtez ça tout de suite, vous nous faites perdre notre temps et vous perdez le vôtre. Ce n'est pas un métier facile, je vous assure que la chose la plus difficile que j'ai eu à faire dans ma carrière, c'est de dire à un sponsor pourtant fort sympathique et fort dévoué, ce truc ne volera jamais, laissez tomber. Ce n'est pas agréable du tout de dire non. C'est plus facile de dire oui et puis d'aller dans le mur. Bon, nous tous, nous essayons de protéger nos institutions, de protéger les peuples qui nous mandatent, parce qu'il ne faut jamais oublier une chose, nous servons des gens. Nous ne servons pas le président de la Banque mondiale, le président de la Banque africaine. Excusez-moi de dire ça, j'ai grand respect pour ces personnes, mais ce n'est pas ça que nous faisons. Nous servons les citoyens. Et en servant les citoyens, nous devons faire quelquefois un travail désagréable de tuer des mauvais projets et d'aider à vivre des projets qui le méritent. Voilà, c'est ça notre travail.
I think that brings us to an end. I'd like to thank our panelists very warmly for having been here today and for having engaged in a lively and I think fruitful discussion. Thanks to you for having been there today, and I wish you a pleasant evening.